Marcus Bennett boarded the plane quietly, carrying himself with the calm dignity of a man who had long grown accustomed to the silent weight of unspoken judgments. At 36, he was a picture of understated elegance. His tailored navy blazer, crisp white shirt, and polished loafers spoke of a life of discipline and quiet ambition. It was a cool morning in Atlanta, and like many others, he was simply trying to reach his destination. For Marcus, that destination was New York City, where a long-awaited business opportunity awaited him. The boarding process was uneventful, marked by the usual shuffle of passengers jockeying for overhead bin space and the faint hum of conversations muted by the drone of the airport. Marcus found his seat in economy class, 22C, an aisle seat he had specifically chosen for the extra legroom. He settled in, buckled his seatbelt, and pulled out a novel from his leather bag. The rhythmic flipping of its pages provided a welcome reprieve from the world outside, a world that often felt more complex and demanding than it needed to be. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary flight. That is, until the flight attendant appeared. She arrived without fanfare, her presence unremarkable save for the briskness in her step and the chill in her tone. Her name tag read, Claire, though she didn't offer an introduction. Her words, delivered without a trace of warmth, broke through Marcus's quiet bubble. "Sir, I need you to move to the back of the plane." Marcus looked up, puzzled. He set his book down carefully, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice measured, polite. "This is my assigned seat." Her eyes, pale and expressionless, fixed on him with an unsettling firmness. "For operational reasons, we need you to move to the back. Please gather your belongings." The words hung in the air, their meaning clear but their rationale murky. Around him, passengers began to glance up from their phones and magazines, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to feigned indifference. Marcus felt their eyes on him, heavy and expectant. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said after a moment, his tone still even. "This seat was confirmed when I checked in. Is there a problem?" Claire's response was swift, her voice sharper now. "Sir, I need you to comply. Please move to the back of the plane." For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The words, comply, and move, echoed in Marcus's mind. There was no malice in her tone, no outright hostility, yet there was something else. Something colder and more insidious, a presumption of authority that expected no questions and offered no answers. Marcus glanced around, searching for understanding or even acknowledgement in the faces of his fellow passengers. But most avoided his gaze, their attention deliberately elsewhere. The space seemed to shrink, the once spacious aisle now feeling stifling and narrow. He felt the knot in his chest tighten, but years of practice kept his face composed. Not wanting to escalate the situation, Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He reached for his bag, his mind racing with questions he knew would remain unanswered. As he stepped into the aisle, he could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the cabin. The shuffle of his shoes against the carpet was the only sound as he made his way toward the back. When he reached the cramped rear section of the plane, there was no direction, no guidance. Claire had already turned away, her focus elsewhere, as if Marcus's presence had been neatly erased. He stood there for a moment, unsure of where to go or what to do, his back pressed lightly against the galley wall. Then they came two security guards, their expressions unreadable, their silence speaking volumes. One gestured toward the exit. There were no explanations, no efforts to soften the blow. Marcus felt the stares of the other passengers again, their curiosity mingling with discomfort. He was being escorted off the plane, and no one seemed willing to ask why. As he stepped off the aircraft and into the crisp morning air of the tarmac, Marcus felt a strange, quiet clarity. The questions burned in his mind, unanswered and unanswerable. Why had he been singled out? Why had he been moved? And, more importantly, why had no one thought it necessary to explain? Yet as he walked toward the terminal, one thought overpowered the rest. This wasn't over. Whatever had just happened, Marcus Bennett wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. For far too long, moments like these had been dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. But Marcus knew better. He had seen this story play out before, not just for himself, but for countless others whose quiet dignity had been met with quiet indignities. And this time, he vowed silently, would be different. In the quiet of the airport terminal, Marcus Bennett sat at a stainless steel bench, his phone resting on his knee as he stared at the departure board without really seeing it. The screen flickered with flight updates, delays, gate changes, and boarding announcements that had no relevance to him anymore. Around him, travelers moved with purpose, their rolling suitcases clicking against the tiled floor. To them, Marcus was just another passenger, anonymous and unremarkable. But inside, he was far from calm. He opened his phone and scrolled through his contacts, landing on the name of his lawyer, Stephen Caldwell. The call connected after 2 rings, and Stephen's familiar voice came through, low and steady. "Marcus, what's going on?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to explain something so intangible yet so infuriating. "They removed me from the plane," he said finally, his voice tight but controlled. "No explanation, just moved to the back, and then security came and escorted me off." There was a pause on the other end. Stephen's response was calm but laced with quiet indignation. "Did they tell you why?" "No," Marcus replied. "They just said it was for operational reasons. But I was in my assigned seat." "Stephen, I didn't do anything." Another pause. Marcus could hear Stephen's chair creak as he leaned back. "Okay," he said, his tone firm now. "We'll handle this. Don't do anything rash. Let me start making some calls." Marcus hung up, his fingers lingering on the screen. His first instinct had been to let the matter drop, to chalk it up to yet another example of the small slights he had learned to endure over the years. But this time felt different. It wasn't just the humiliation of being asked to move or even being removed from the plane, it was the absence of any justification. The silence spoke volumes, carrying a weight that Marcus couldn't ignore. He opened the Twitter app on his phone. The blank text box stared back at him, waiting for his words. Slowly, he began to type. "Just got kicked off my flight for no reason. This is unacceptable and feels like discrimination. At airline name, what's going on?" He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the post button. There was something final about sharing this publicly, a step that would take the issue out of his hands and into the court of public opinion. But Marcus had spent too many years swallowing his frustration, convincing himself that silence was the safer option. He pressed post. The tweet went live, the words hanging in the digital ether. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his phone buzzed once, twice, and then repeatedly as notifications began to roll in. Strangers from all over the country, people he would never meet, started commenting, liking, and sharing his post. The responses were a mix of outrage, support, and skepticism. Some offered solidarity, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by airlines. Others questioned the details, demanding to know what had really happened. A few dismissed his claims outright, their words laced with condescension or doubt. Marcus scrolled through the comments, his emotions shifting between gratitude and frustration. He knew this was only the beginning. The power of the internet was both a blessing and a burden. It could amplify his voice, but it could also invite scrutiny he wasn't sure he was ready for. Then, as if to underscore the seriousness of his decision, his phone buzzed with a notification from a local news station. They had retweeted his post and added their own caption. "Passenger claims discrimination after being removed from flight. Airline has yet to respond." Marcus felt a twinge of unease. He hadn't expected the story to spread so quickly. But now that it had, there was no turning back. He stared out at the terminal, where passengers shuffled past with little regard for the man sitting on the bench, whose story was beginning to ripple beyond the confines of this airport. In the hours that followed, Marcus watched as his post gained traction. The airline's social media account remained silent, but other voices began to fill the void. Civil rights advocates, journalists, and everyday citizens weighed in, each comment adding a layer to the growing narrative. By the end of the day, Marcus received a call from the airline's customer service department. The voice on the other end was polished and polite, but there was a distinct detachment to their words. "Mr. Bennett, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience you experienced today," the representative said. "We're reviewing the situation and will get back to you with a resolution shortly." The phrasing was careful, calculated. Marcus could hear the effort to contain the situation without addressing the core issue. He responded evenly, refusing to let his frustration show. "I don't want an apology," he said. "I want to know why I was removed. What were these operational reasons you mentioned? I deserve an explanation." There was a pause. the faint hum of typing on a keyboard filling the silence. "I'm afraid I don't have that information at this time, Mr. Bennett, but we'll be investigating the matter thoroughly." Marcus ended the call, feeling no closer to an answer than he had been hours earlier. He stared at his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dim terminal. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The day had stretched into something far more complicated than he had anticipated. But Marcus felt a quiet resolve settling over him. This wasn't just about his seat on a plane anymore. It wasn't even about the humiliation he had endured. It was about something larger, something that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. It was about the subtle, insidious ways people were made to feel less than, their dignity stripped away under the guise of procedure or policy. Marcus knew this fight wouldn't be easy. But as he sat there, watching the world move on around him, he decided it was a fight worth having. The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. His apartment was quiet, save for the occasional hum of traffic outside. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, an unshakable weight that felt both personal and universal. He had gone to bed with the faint hope that time would dull the sting of the experience. But instead, it had only sharpened it. His phone buzzed on the table. Another notification. He picked it up and scrolled through the growing number of comments on his post. By now, his story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets were running headlines. Passenger alleges discrimination by major airline, and airline faces backlash over viral incident. Marcus wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. It was validating, in a way, to see people rallying around him. But there was something unsettling about the speed at which his experience had become public property. Dissected and debated by strangers. Some comments were supportive, others dismissive, a few were outright hostile. Then, amid the noise, a private message appeared in his inbox. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the message was short and direct. "I saw what happened to you. This isn't the first time. They've done this before." Marcus stared at the message, rereading it several times. It was unsigned, and the profile picture was a generic silhouette. He hesitated, considering whether to respond. Something about the simplicity of the message felt sincere, even urgent. After a moment, he typed a reply. "Who are you? What do you mean?" The response came quickly. "My name is Lisa. I used to work for the airline. I've seen things they don't want people to know. Can we talk?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew reaching out to a stranger carried risks. But something about Lisa's words struck a chord. He typed back. "When and where? Blank. _ blank." Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe downtown. The space was sparsely populated, the low murmur of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. He watched the door, unsure what to expect. Lisa arrived a few minutes late, a young woman in her late 20s with dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her expression both nervous and determined. She spotted Marcus and approached his table, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. "Marcus?" she asked softly. He nodded and gestured for her to sit. She slid into the chair across from him, her movements cautious, as though she were checking to make sure no one was watching. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if I should reach out. But after I saw your story, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Marcus studied her, sensing the tension in her posture. "You said you used to work for the airline?" She nodded. "I was a flight attendant for 3 years. I left last year. The things I saw, the way they treat certain passengers, it never sat right with me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus leaned forward. "What did you see?" Lisa hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before settling on the table between them. "It's not just you," she said finally. "There's a pattern. Passengers of color being targeted, sometimes for small things, sometimes for no reason at all. The staff is trained to handle difficult passengers." But, she trailed off, her hands twisting in her lap. The definition of difficult always seemed to depend on how someone looked. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed was another matter. "Are you saying this is company policy?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. Lisa shook her head. "Not officially. It's more subtle than that. They don't put it in writing. But it's understood. Certain passengers are watched more closely, flagged for minor infractions, or asked to move seats under the guise of operational needs. And if there's any pushback, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. They call security. The words hit Marcus like a blow. He had always known the world wasn't fair, but the deliberate nature of what Lisa described felt like a betrayal. Why didn't anyone speak up? He asked. Lisa's expression hardened. Because it's dangerous. People who complain don't last long. They get written up for minor mistakes or transferred to less desirable routes. And the passengers who are targeted? Most of them don't push back. They just want to get to their destination. They don't want to make trouble. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding all too well the desire to avoid confrontation. But you left, he said. Why? Lisa's eyes flickered with emotion. Because I couldn't keep pretending it was okay. I saw passengers humiliated, removed from flights, treated like they didn't belong. I hated myself for being part of it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. These are internal memos. They don't say it outright, but they show how complaints were handled, especially complaints from passengers of color. Most of them were dismissed without investigation. Marcus unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the lines of text. The language was vague but unmistakable, full of coded phrases about customer behavior and escalation protocols. It was proof not conclusive, but enough to suggest that what had happened to him was part of a larger issue. This isn't just about me, he said quietly, more to himself than to Lisa. She nodded. No, it's not. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them like a heavy fog. Finally, Marcus looked up. Will you help me? He asked. If I decide to take this further, will you stand with me? Lisa hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Then she nodded. Yes, I will. As Marcus left the cafe that day, the folded memo in his pocket, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. This wasn't just about his experience anymore. It was about exposing the cracks beneath the surface, the quiet injustices that too often went unspoken. The fight was just beginning. The press conference was held in a modest community center on the outskirts of the city. The walls were plain, the folding chairs mismatched, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee. It was not a glamorous venue. But that didn't matter. The room was filled with a quiet tension, the kind that lingers before something important is said. Marcus Bennett stood at the front, his hands resting on a plain wooden podium. Behind him, a projector screen displayed a slide with the simple heading, "The Truth They Don't Want You to Know." To his left sat Lisa, her posture stiff but resolute. And to his right, his lawyer, Stephen Caldwell, radiating the steady confidence that Marcus had come to rely on. The room was not packed, but it held a respectable number of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. A few cameras were set up at the back, their lenses trained on Marcus, capturing every detail. He could feel the weight of their attention, but he remained calm, steadying himself with a deep breath. Good afternoon, he began, his voice clear but measured. Thank you all for being here. My name is Marcus Bennett, and I am here to tell you a story. But this isn't just my story, it's the story of countless others who have faced silent indignities, who have been mistreated and dismissed, and who, like me, have had enough. The room was quiet, save for the occasional scratch of a reporter's pen against paper. Marcus continued, his tone calm but deliberate. A few days ago, I boarded a flight expecting nothing more than a routine journey. Instead, I found myself being asked to move without explanation, then removed from the plane altogether. What happened to me was humiliating. Yes, but it was also indicative of something far more troubling. He gestured to the screen behind him, where Lisa had pulled up an internal memo from the airline. The text was projected clearly for everyone to see. Its bureaucratic language filled with phrases like customer escalation and behavioral monitoring. This, Marcus said, turning back to the audience, is a glimpse into how certain passengers are treated not because of what they've done, but because of who they are. This document, provided by a former employee, shows a pattern of dismissing complaints and targeting specific passengers based on arbitrary criteria. And when you read between the lines, the message becomes clear. Lisa stepped forward then, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. I worked for this airline for 3 years, she said. Her voice quiet but steady. I saw things that didn't sit right with me. Passengers singled out, asked to move, or even removed from flights for reasons that were never explained. Most of the time, those passengers looked like Mr. Bennett. And when they tried to speak up, their complaints went nowhere. The journalists scribbled furiously, their pens moving in unison. Marcus watched them, wondering if they truly understood the depth of what they were hearing. It wasn't just about an airline. It was about the quiet ways in which people were made to feel less than. The unspoken rules that governed who was welcome and who wasn't. Lisa clicked to the next slide, which showed a series of anonymized passenger complaints, all describing similar experiences. The words, "asked to move," "no explanation," and "security called," appeared repeatedly. This isn't an isolated incident, Marcus said, stepping back to the podium. It's a pattern, and patterns like these don't happen by accident. They happen because they're allowed to. Because the systems in place enable and perpetuate them. He paused, letting the words sink in. The faces in the room were a mix of outrage and quiet understanding. For some, this was new information. For others, it was simply confirmation of what they had always known. When the press conference ended, Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had laid the truth bare. But what would happen next was out of his hands. As he stepped away from the podium, reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping. "Mr. Bennett, do you believe this was racially motivated?" "Lisa, were you ever instructed to profile passengers?" "Stephen, do you plan to pursue legal action?" Marcus answered carefully, knowing that his words would be scrutinized. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about a system that needs to be held accountable. And yes, I believe race played a role not just in my case, but in many others." Lisa's response was equally measured. No one ever said it outright, but it was understood. Certain passengers were watched more closely, treated differently. "I can't be silent about that anymore. Blank. Underscore, blank." That evening, as Marcus sat in his living room, the weight of the day finally settled over him. His phone buzzed with messages of support, friends, family, even strangers who had seen the press conference. But there were other messages too, less kind, accusing him of stirring up trouble where none existed. He sighed and set the phone down, staring out the window at the city lights. The fight ahead was daunting, but it was one he had chosen. For too long, people like him had been told to stay quiet, to not make waves, but Marcus had reached his limit. Silence, he realized, was a luxury he could no longer afford. In the days to come, the airline would issue statements, denying systemic issues and promising vague investigations. But Marcus knew the truth now. And so did the public. The cracks were beginning to show. And all it would take was enough pressure to bring the whole facade crumbling down. The fight was no longer about him. It was about exposing what lay hidden beneath the surface, a quiet, insidious inequality that had been allowed to thrive in plain sight. And Marcus was determined to make sure it was seen. The first response from the airline came quietly, like a pebble tossed into a vast ocean. A brief statement posted on their social media channels read, "We are aware of the incident involving Mr. Bennett and are conducting a thorough review of the matter. We are committed to ensuring all passengers have a positive experience with us." The words were carefully chosen, measured in their vagueness. There was no mention of discrimination, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a promise to review and a vague commitment to improvement. Marcus read the statement twice, feeling the familiar frustration of being dismissed. It was the kind of response designed to calm the surface without addressing the deeper currents. Still, he wasn't surprised. By now, the story had grown far beyond his initial tweet. News outlets had picked up on the press conference, and clips of Lisa's testimony were circulating widely online. Discussions of racial profiling and systemic bias were reignited, with commentators debating the larger implications of what had happened to Marcus. Support poured in from unexpected places: civil rights groups, community leaders, and even a few prominent public figures who called for accountability. But the airline wasn't staying silent either. Behind the scenes, they were preparing their counterattack. Blank. Underscore, blank. 2 days after the press conference, Marcus's phone rang. It was Stephen. "Marcus," Stephen began, his tone heavier than usual. "I need you to be prepared. The airline is pushing back." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "They've hired a PR firm, one of the big ones. They're putting out a narrative that paints this as a misunderstanding, a one-off incident, and they're trying to discredit you." The words hit Marcus like a cold wind. "Discredit me? How?" "They're saying you overreacted, that this was a miscommunication blown out of proportion. They might even dig into your background to find anything they can use to undermine your credibility." Marcus was silent for a moment, the weight of Stephen's warning sinking in. He had expected resistance, but this felt more personal. "And Lisa?" he asked. "Will they go after her too?" Stephen hesitated. "It's possible, but she knew the risks when she came forward. And she's willing to stand by you." Marcus sighed, a deep weariness settling over him. He had never imagined himself in the middle of such a storm. Yet here he was, caught between his own fight for justice and a corporate giant with seemingly endless resources. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The airline's counter-narrative began subtly, with carefully placed articles in industry publications and interviews with their spokespeople. They described Marcus's removal as an unfortunate but necessary operational decision, and emphasized their commitment to diversity. They highlighted their training programs, their inclusive hiring practices, and their history of charitable contributions to underserved communities. It was a textbook strategy: distract, deflect, and deny. Marcus watched the coverage with a mixture of anger and resignation. The stories were polished, the language clinical. They spoke of policies and procedures, never once addressing the human cost of their actions. It was as if he were a footnote in his own story, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Then came the personal attacks. Anonymous accounts on social media began posting inflammatory comments under his tweets. Some accused him of seeking attention, others of fabricating the entire incident. One comment read, "Why didn't he just follow the rules? People like him always want to play the victim." Marcus stared at the screen, his chest tightening. The words were sharp, but what hurt more was the familiarity of them. He had heard variations of this rhetoric before. In boardrooms, at networking events, even in casual conversations. The idea that speaking up was an act of defiance rather than courage. Lisa wasn't spared either. A blogger with connections to the airline published an article questioning her credibility, painting her as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. The piece was filled with innuendo and half-truths, but it was enough to cast doubt in the minds of those who were already skeptical. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Despite the mounting attacks, Marcus refused to back down. He leaned on his growing network of supporters, meeting with activists and journalists to keep the pressure on the airline. Each time the company tried to deflect, Marcus and his team pushed back with more evidence, more testimonies, and more public scrutiny. Lisa, too, held her ground. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," she told Marcus during one of their late-night calls. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. They can say what they want about me, I know what I saw." Her words bolstered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She had risked everything to stand beside him, and her resolve was a reminder that this fight was about more than just his own dignity. Blank. Underscore. Blank. By the end of the week, the tide began to shift. More former employees came forward. Anonymously at first, then publicly. Each new voice added to the mosaic of evidence against the airline. Stories of passengers being removed without cause, of complaints being ignored, and of internal policies that encouraged profiling began to paint a damning picture. The hashtag no excuses began trending, a rallying cry for those demanding accountability. And yet, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The airline still had the resources to spin the narrative, to drag the process out until public interest waned. But Marcus also knew something they didn't: the power of quiet, steady persistence. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On a particularly cold evening, Marcus sat in his living room, a cup of tea warming his hands as he reread an email from a former senior manager at the airline. The subject line was simple: "You're not alone." The email described years of systemic issues within the company, issues that had been reported internally but never addressed. It ended with a single line that stayed with Marcus long after he closed his laptop: "Keep fighting. The truth has a way of coming to light." For the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself to smile. The cracks in the facade were growing, and with each new voice, the foundation beneath the airline's narrative weakened. The fight was far from over. But Marcus was more determined than ever to see it through. This wasn't just about holding the airline accountable, it was about showing that even the smallest voices could make themselves heard when they refused to be silenced. The courtroom was a space of quiet tension, its polished wooden benches filled with spectators, reporters, and supporters. The air was still, heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Marcus Bennett sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Beside him, Stephen Caldwell shuffled through a stack of papers, the faint rustle breaking the silence. The airline's legal team occupied the opposite table, a small army of sharp-suited attorneys armed with binders and laptops. Their expressions were calm, confident professionals accustomed to deflecting accusations and protecting powerful corporations. Yet there was a flicker of unease beneath their polished exteriors. The evidence Marcus had brought to light had already caused cracks in their facade, and this trial threatened to widen them. The judge entered, her gavel striking the wooden block with a sharp report. The room rose and fell into silence, and the proceedings began. Blank. Blank. Stephen opened with a measured statement, his voice steady and deliberate. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is not about one isolated incident. It's about a pattern of discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long. My client, Marcus Bennett, experienced this firsthand when he was removed from a flight without explanation. But as we will show, his story is just one of many. He paused, letting his words settle. We are not here to assign blame to a single individual or to vilify an entire organization. We are here to seek accountability for actions that have caused harm. Not just to Mr. Bennett, but to countless others. The jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They were ordinary people, tasked with untangling the complex threads of a story that, on the surface, might have seemed like a simple misunderstanding. But as Stephen spoke, the deeper implications of the case began to take shape. Blank. The first witness was Lisa. She walked to the stand with quiet determination, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she took the oath. Stephen guided her through her testimony, his questions careful and precise. Ms. Carter, can you describe your time working for the airline? He asked. Lisa nodded. I worked as a flight attendant for 3 years. During that time, I saw a pattern of certain passengers being treated differently, singled out, questioned, even removed from flights. Most of the time, those passengers were people of color. Stephen stepped closer, his voice calm but insistent. And was this treatment based on specific behavior or actions? Lisa hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Marcus before returning to Stephen. No, she said softly. It wasn't about what they did. It was about assumptions about how they looked. The room was silent as her words hung in the air. On the other side of the courtroom, the airline's attorneys exchanged glances but said nothing. Stephen continued, Ms. Carter, you provided internal documents to support your testimony. Can you explain what those documents show? Lisa gestured toward the screen behind her, where a series of memos were displayed. These are internal reports. They show complaints from passengers who felt they were unfairly targeted. Most of those complaints were dismissed without investigation. Stephen nodded. And why did you decide to come forward? Lisa's voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. Because I couldn't stay silent anymore. What happened to Marcus wasn't an accident. It was part of a system that needs to change. Blank. The defense took their turn. Their questions sharper, their tone more aggressive. They tried to paint Lisa as a disgruntled employee, someone with a personal vendetta against the airline. But Lisa remained composed, her answers clear and unwavering. When Marcus took the stand, he mirrored her calm demeanor. He described his experience in detail, his voice steady but tinged with the quiet pain of someone who had spent years enduring slights and indignities that were easier to ignore than confront. Mr. Bennett, Stephen asked, why did you choose to pursue this case? Marcus took a deep breath before answering. Because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been made to feel less than. Everyone who has been told they don't belong. I wanted to stand up. Not just for myself, but for all those who couldn't. The airline's attorneys countered with their own narrative, insisting that Marcus's removal was a misunderstanding, an operational decision that had nothing to do with race. They pointed to the airline's diversity initiatives and corporate policies, arguing that such actions were anomalies. not systemic. But their defense began to falter when the whistleblower's testimony was introduced. The former manager, speaking anonymously, revealed internal communications that exposed the subtle but pervasive culture of profiling within the organization. His words were calm, almost detached, but their implications were devastating. The language was coded. He said, "We were told to monitor certain passengers and to prioritize operational efficiency. But we all understood what that meant. Blank. Blank." As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of evidence and interpretation. Each side presented their case with meticulous precision. But the undercurrent of racial bias was impossible to ignore. It was there in the memos, in the testimonies, in the patterns that emerged when the data was laid bare. By the time closing arguments began, the jury had seen enough to understand that this case was not about a single incident. It was about a system that had allowed such incidents to occur. Unchecked and unchallenged, Stephen's final words were simple but powerful. This case is about dignity. It's about fairness. And it's about holding those in power accountable for the harm they cause. Whether intentional or not, we ask you to see the truth for what it is and to ensure that it is not ignored. Blank. When the jury left to deliberate, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. He had done everything he could, spoken every truth he knew. Now, it was out of his hands. The hours stretched into a day. Then two. Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable as they filed into the courtroom. Marcus held his breath as the foreman stood. The verdict in hand, "We find the defendant guilty of systemic discrimination." The words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried the weight of justice long overdue. Marcus exhaled slowly, a sense of relief washing over him. This was only one step in a much larger journey. But it was a step that mattered. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus sat for a moment, letting the significance of the moment settle over him. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like the tide was turning. The truth had been seen. And that, he knew, was where change always began. The verdict rippled outward, stirring reactions that Marcus Bennett could only observe from a distance. News anchors dissected the implications of the case on evening broadcasts. Civil rights organizations celebrated the ruling as a victory. And social media buzzed with calls for reform. Marcus, however, felt a quiet ambivalence. Justice had been served, but the scars of the fight lingered. The airline, under pressure from public outcry, issued a formal apology the day after the verdict. The CEO stood behind a podium, his words carefully scripted. "We deeply regret the harm caused to Mr. Bennett and others who have felt unwelcome on our flights. This incident has prompted us to take a hard look at our policies. And we are committed to making meaningful changes." The apology was polite, perfunctory, and devoid of any true accountability. Marcus watched the broadcast in his living room, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had learned long ago to recognize the difference between remorse and damage control. Still, he hoped the scrutiny would force the airline to follow through on their promises. However reluctantly. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of media appearances and community meetings. Marcus became a reluctant symbol. His story cited as evidence of progress in a country still reckoning with its long history of racial inequities. He met with civil rights leaders, spoke at advocacy events, and participated in panels about systemic discrimination in corporate culture. At each event, he was met with gratitude and praise. But the attention left him uneasy. He hadn't sought the spotlight. His goal had never been to become a public figure. Yet he recognized the responsibility that came with his newfound platform. If his story could inspire others to stand up, if it could spark even the smallest change, then the discomfort was worth it. Lisa remained by his side, her quiet determination a source of strength. "You started something bigger than either of us," she told him one evening as they reviewed the latest flurry of interview requests. "People see you as proof that they don't have to stay silent." Marcus nodded but said nothing. He knew Lisa was right. But the weight of being a symbol was heavier than he had anticipated. He missed the simplicity of his life before the flight, before the incident that had upended everything. Amid the public triumph, the personal cost of the fight was harder to ignore. Marcus's relationships had shifted, strained by the intensity of the past months. Friends and family offered their support, but he often felt isolated. His days consumed by legal proceedings, interviews, and the constant scrutiny of the public eye. One evening, he found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of tea. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the countless others who had experienced similar injustices but lacked the resources or resilience to fight back. He thought about the small moments of indignity that so many endured in silence, each one a quiet erosion of their humanity. The fight had been worth it, but it had also been exhausting. He wondered if the airline truly understood the depth of the harm they had caused, not just to him, but to everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, invisible, or unwelcome. Blank. Despite his fatigue, Marcus pressed on. He worked with Lisa and Steven to ensure the airline followed through on the court's mandate, an independent review of their practices, comprehensive anti-discrimination training for employees, and a public acknowledgement of systemic failures. He knew that real change would take time, and he was determined to hold them accountable. Public sentiment remained overwhelmingly supportive, but there were those who questioned whether the case had been blown out of proportion. Marcus saw the comments online, heard the murmurs at events. Was it really that bad? They asked. Didn't the airline apologize? He didn't bother responding. He knew that for every visible act of discrimination, there were countless others that went unnoticed, dismissed, or justified. His case was not an anomaly, it was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive issue. Blank. One afternoon, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the penmanship neat but unsteady. The sender introduced themselves as an older woman who had experienced a similar incident years ago. I was too afraid to speak up. The letter read, but watching you fight has given me hope. Thank you for showing the world that we don't have to accept this. Marcus read the letter twice, his chest tightening. It was a simple message, but it reminded him why he had started this fight. For every public victory, there were private moments like this, moments that affirmed the importance of standing up, no matter the cost. Blank. As the months wore on, the public's attention began to shift. New headlines emerged. New stories captured the collective consciousness. The world moved on, as it always did, but Marcus knew that the impact of his case would linger, even if his name eventually faded from memory. In quiet moments, he reflected on what the fight had taught him, not just about the world, but about himself. He had learned to trust his voice, to stand firm in the face of doubt and adversity. And he had learned that change, though slow and often painful, was always possible. One evening, as he stood on his balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, he knew that. But for now, he could rest, knowing that he had made a difference. The cost of justice had been high, but the reward, a small but meaningful step toward equity, was worth it. The conference room was filled with an air of quiet expectation. Rows of chairs faced a simple podium, where Marcus Bennett stood, adjusting the microphone. The room was not extravagant, just a modest space in a community center, but it was filled with people who had come to hear him speak. Most were older, some using canes or wheelchairs, their faces etched with the marks of long lives lived in a complex world. They watched Marcus with patient attentiveness, their expressions kind but curious. He began slowly, his voice calm and steady. Thank you for being here today. I'm not here as an expert or a leader. I'm here as someone who, like many of you, faced a moment where silence was no longer an option. The room remained silent, save for the faint rustle of someone shifting in their chair. Marcus paused, collecting his thoughts. He wanted to speak plainly, without dramatics. The story itself was enough. You've likely heard about my experience with the airline. It was one moment, one flight, but it revealed something bigger, something that's been part of the fabric of our society for far too long. It's the quiet ways we are told who belongs and who doesn't, who is welcome and who is not. He glanced at the audience, noting the way their eyes stayed fixed on him. These were people who had lived through decades of change, who had seen the peaks and valleys of progress. They knew, better than most, how slow and uneven that progress could be. Marcus recounted the events of that day not with anger, but with the clarity that comes from reflection. He spoke of the flight attendant's cold dismissal, the silence of the passengers, and the humiliating walk to the back of the plane. He described the confusion that turned to determination and the decision to speak out, even when it would have been easier to let the moment pass. It wasn't about the seat, he said quietly. It was about the message. The message that some people's comfort matters more than others. That some people's presence is an inconvenience, something to be moved, hidden, or removed altogether. There was a soft murmur in the room, a shared understanding. These were not new ideas to his audience, they were truths they had lived with for decades. But hearing them articulated with such quiet precision brought those truths into sharper focus. Blank. Blank. Marcus shifted to the aftermath, the press conference, the trial, and the verdict. He spoke of the support he had received, but also the backlash, the attempts to discredit him, the strain on his personal life, and the moments when he wondered if the fight was worth it. But then, he said, his voice steady, there would be a letter, or a conversation, someone telling me their story, thanking me for standing up because they couldn't. And I realized that the fight wasn't just mine. It belonged to all of us. He gestured toward the room, his tone softening. You've all lived through moments like this, moments where you were told to stay quiet, to not make waves, but you didn't. That's why we're here today. Because each of us, in our own way, has chosen to push back against a world that sometimes tries to make us invisible. Blank. The conversation turned to the broader implications of his case. The airline had made changes, revised policies, instituted new training programs, but Marcus was skeptical of how deep those changes would go. He spoke of the need for vigilance, for continued pressure to ensure that progress wasn't just performative. But this isn't just about airlines, he said. It's about the systems that allow these moments to happen over and over again. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the ways we let those things shape our actions. His words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. The room was silent, the audience lost in their own thoughts. Marcus knew he couldn't offer solutions to problems this entrenched, but he hoped his story would serve as a catalyst, a reminder that change, however small, was always possible. Blank. As the event came to a close, an older woman in the front row raised her hand. Marcus nodded toward her, and she stood slowly, steadying herself with the armrest of her chair. I just wanted to say thank you, she began, her voice wavering but strong. Thank you for standing up when so many of us couldn't. It's not easy to fight a giant, but you did, and you made them see us. Her words struck a chord, and the room erupted in quiet applause. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat but kept his composure. He nodded, his gratitude unspoken but clear. That evening, as Marcus sat in his apartment, he reflected on the day, the applause, the gratitude they were affirming, but they also carried a sobering reminder of the work that remained. Change was not a destination, it was a journey, one that required constant effort and vigilance. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email to Lisa. They had stayed in touch, their shared experience forging a bond that felt unshakable. He wrote about the event, the people he had met, and the woman's words, they made me see us. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of quiet contentment. The fight was far from over, but moments like these reminded him why it mattered. He had helped shine a light on something that had long been hidden. And now, that light was impossible to extinguish. As he closed his laptop and looked out at the city lights, Marcus felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to keep walking. Because in the end, justice wasn't about winning a single case. It was about creating a world where no one had to fight the same battle again.